I got frostbite on my feet on 25th March 1942. The diagnosis indicated in the medical history on a paper with green edges was unambiguous frostbite, toes 2nd degree, left heel 3rd degree, right heel 2nd to 3rd degree. Only later did I learn how close I had come to losing my feet. You must be lucky, the field surgeon said. And I was. As the sun began to warm up and the snow began to melt and the ground warmed, and as the whole area turned into solid swamps, my feet slowly came back to life. The doctors cut away the rotting flesh and prescribed a stinking ointment. The numbness gradually gave way to pain, and then changing bandages, the slightest touch began to hurt like hell. I kept my legs up high so I wouldn't feel the blood pulsing through them. It took weeks before the pain began to subside. And when one day the roads were passable, I was loaded into an ambulance with some of the wounded, and those with scarlet fever and jaundice, and taken to a hospital in the rear. There I met the sheikh again. The name hospital was somewhat of an exaggeration. A hospital is where there are snow-white bed linen and clean-cut Red Cross nurses. We were lying in our underwear and footies in long rows on large mattresses right on the floor, and our only carers were regular soldiers with peasant faces. The medic, a young doctor with the manners of a Prussian, made his rounds once a day to record our complaints. Even as we lay prostrate on our backs, he demanded military posture and discipline. But his main concern was to select those who could already be sent to the front. The sheikh was just beginning to get back on his feet. I, too, was recovering rather slowly, and we waddled around together all day long to kill time. At first we played chess, but we soon got bored with it, and were delighted when we discovered a small gambling house on the first floor. Outwardly indifferent, a man takes the cards. Outwardly indifferent, he bets on the line. Outwardly indifferent, the banker shows his cards. But if you look more closely, you can see the glitter of the eyes, the nervous movements of the hands, and how greedily the winner takes his prize. You can catch the trembling in people's voices and feel the excitement that takes over from the apathy that comes after a long military service. At first we played with a wary eye, but then the game took us over. The tension gradually began to stir our blood. On the first night, Sheikh lost 2 months' allowance, but the next day he won it back double. We became regulars and spent hours forgetting everything in the world. One evening, while we were playing, the medical sergeant came in and asked if we had been swabbed. "What the hell does that mean?" I asked one of the soldiers. "You're a naive simpleton," he replied with a chuckle. "Don't tell me you haven't noticed that most of the guys here have an STD. "What STD? I wondered. "Oh my God, the tripper, mate, the tripper." "It's not half as bad as that," the other grinned. "It's just a joke these days. They've got this ointment that's first class. It doesn't take 2 weeks to go away, but you get 2 weeks holiday." "Are you saying that because it's so harmless it makes sense to catch it deliberately?" "Of course you're a fool if you don't know. What would you give me if I set you up with a local whore who's totally reliable? All she needs is a few cigarettes and it's all over. The best time to catch a disease is just before you're about to be discharged. Just don't report it on the very first day, or all you'll get is an injection and all your suffering will be for nothing. But won't you be put away for 3 days on your own if you report it too late?" Of course they will. And you'll spend 3 days in solitary confinement, but that means 3 fewer days at the front. It's amazing, I said to myself, what they can think of. But the sheikh turned quickly to the chap who had given me this free advice. "I don't suppose you know of any other prostitutes available. The kind that don't get the tripper, but don't look like a reanimated broom handle either. I'd give 10 cigarettes for that." "You don't need much, do you?" the other one asked. "Go to the doctor, he'll write you a prescription." Apart from the Croats, who were the gamblers, there were also a few young Walloons in the hospital. They kept to themselves and often spent hours discussing something in whispers. Only one of them was a wounded man. The others had Volhynian fever, which was widely regarded as a little-known variety of trench fever, with an intermittent up-and-down temperature accompanied by severe headaches and pains in the limbs. I decided to talk to them, and the sheikh joined me. We sat down with them and tried to carry on a conversation in our high school French. First we talked about our wounds, then about the terrible cold of the past winter and the new German offensive soon to come. Then the sheikh asked them bluntly why was it that they, the Belgians, had volunteered for the Eastern Front. They seemed surprised that he had asked this question. "Why are we here?" they asked. "Well, it's obvious to prevent Bolshevism from approaching our homeland. Isn't the whole of Europe trying its best to achieve this?" The sheikh asked what they thought of the war in Russia. Yes, they admitted, they had expected it to be quite different. Above all, they had underestimated the mental strain. Their initial enthusiasm had given way to a more fatalistic attitude. But they will continue to fight because they see it as their duty. They know perfectly well why they are here, they said, but feel that the average German soldier has no clarity at all on the matter. And a dark-haired chap with an intelligent face and dead pale, sunken cheeks said, "You Germans are strong because you are united and you have a strong man at the helm. In that we envy you, but you are strong only in the masses. You fight like devils, but each individual does it without firm conviction. He fights only because he has learnt to obey orders." Later, as we stretched out on our mattresses, Sheikh grumbled, "Poor fools, volunteering to get into this mess just for the fun of it." I said they're real idealists. Yes, I suppose you could look at it that way. Gambling was, of course, illegal. If we were caught, all the money from the table, down to the last pfennig, would be confiscated. For this reason, one of us always stood guard in case the head doctor or the treasurer showed up. Still, one day we were taken by surprise. The warning whistle blew at the last moment. Everyone scooped up their money and was about to run away when the treasurer with a potbelly appeared in the aisle. "Gambling again, you hypocritical bastards," he roared, his face turning red. "I'll catch you red-handed for once." Then he burned the sheik with a glare. "And what in God's name are you doing here? Aren't you from the ground floor?" The sheik was so embarrassed that this time his presence of mind failed him, he even stammered. The treasurer was just pissed off because he had climbed these stairs for nothing and was now letting off steam. "How are you talking to me?" He attacked the sheik. "Stand still. You don't seem to know how to respect an officer." Although he was only a bloody clerk, he had an officer's rank and put special emphasis on that magical word officer. In response, Sheikh kept saying that's right and no way, even though he was seething inside. "Go to your place," shouted the pot-bellied man. Sheikh was uncomfortable at the sight of his roommates gloating at him as he descended the stairs. He thought only of revenge. "Wait at my place," he said. "I'll settle accounts with that bastard, even if it's the last thing I have left to do." A few days later, that's exactly what he did. It was a unique revenge. Only someone like Sheikh could think of something like this. Centre's bitch was a purebred Eastern European sheepdog. The treasurer simply adored this animal and spoke to her as if she were human. The sheikh learnt that Centre was in heat. Then the fun began. All that was needed to carry out his sinister plan was to find someone who could speak Russian. Soon we found someone who happily agreed to help. They both looked out of the window of our room and called out to a young Ukrainian man who was passing by. They exchanged a few words. The young man scratched his head, received the tobacco offered to him by the sheikh, and went away grinning. An hour later the lad returned. He was dragging a stubborn dog on a leash. "This is the one," Sheikh said knowingly. "The loveliest mongrel dog I ever saw." He ran to the treasurer's room where Centre was usually locked up. The key was sticking outside. Centre jumped out, wagging her tail and running around, petting her liberator. "Come on, sweetheart," Sheikh said. "Why don't you have some fun for once?" Bitch didn't need to be told twice. and neither did the yard dog. Once he smelled her, there was nothing to hold him back. The Ukrainian let go of the leash, and the dog jumped to center. Now the sheikh rushed into the treasurer's office. "Hurry, Mr. Officer," he shouted. "Your bitch!" She could get into trouble. The treasurer sprang outside, breathing heavily and puffing. "Center. What in heaven's name are you doing, Center? To me, I say, to me," he shouted. But Center no longer cared for anything. The desperate treasurer shouted for a bucket of water to be brought, but before it could be done, he grabbed the dog's severed tail with both hands and pulled hard on it, trying to stop the shameful process. The dog growled and bit him, but did not pull away from his partner. Grumbling, the purser snatched a bucket of water from the orderly and poured its contents over both sinners. The yard dog recoiled in surprise, shook off his fur, looked round suspiciously, and trotted away. The whole hospital was at the windows, bursting into hysterical laughter. The sheikh turned to those around him. "Now we need to find out the name of that dog and where he lives," he said in a mundane tone. "What for? Are you slow to realize?" For alimony, of course. Now the weather was beautiful. The sun shone brightly on the dusty streets. There was a continuous flow of soldiers and armaments to the front. A new big German offensive had begun. The whole front was in motion. A bomb fell on the street in front of the hospital. All the window panes shattered. The explosion threw us against the back wall. An army officer's car covered half of the deep crater that had formed. Its front wheels hovered over the edge of the crater, but it did not appear to be damaged. Two stunned officers, a colonel and a lieutenant, both white as a sheet, got out of the car. At once 50 men were discharged from the hospital. The sheikh and I were among them. It was with heavy hearts that we left for the front. We travelled on passing army lorries, constantly checking our direction from one position on the front line to another. We were told that our division was somewhere near Kharkov. We were not particularly happy about this because Kharkov, according to the reports, was in the thick of the fighting. A plume of dust followed our truck, and instantly our uniforms, hair and face were covered with a thin grey layer. The dust clogged our noses and mouths and made our throats sore. It was scorching hot. By the roadside lay a dead man. A Russian, in his brownish earth-coloured uniform. As it was still a long way from the front, we wondered how he had got here. A minute later Sheikh pointed to the other side of the road, "But there's another one over there." After that we encountered more and more bodies. For many kilometres the road was strewn with bodies at regular intervals, often several at a time, as if there was a lot of rubbish that had been swept aside in piles. Wide-open eyes stared at us, frozen hands were stretched out towards us, and above all this half-covered, bloody human flesh, the sun was shining. It flooded all these bodies with its rays, causing fumes to fill the air with the sweet stench of decomposition. Without uttering a word, we looked left and right at these motionless bodies at the edges of the road. Later we met one of our own who explained it all. "A large column of prisoners passed along this road the other day," he said. "Never before had we felt such bitterness. Franzel, Willie and Kovac greeted us noisily. Peel was absent, he had a bullet wound in his arm, but they said he would be back with us soon. Now we saw almost entirely unfamiliar faces around us. While we were away, many reservists had been called up to replenish the personnel. The company suffered heavy losses. The last few days were especially hard. Sergeant Hegelberg and Sergeant Bax, who commanded the 2nd platoon and the heavy machine gun platoon, were killed. Many others were killed as well. Welty was wounded, but unfortunately not so severely that he could be discharged from the company. Then Franzel stunned us with more news. "Who do you think has joined us, lads? You, Sheikh, are particularly familiar with him." Sheikh strained his memory. "He'll never guess," exclaimed Franzel. "Well, I'll tell you, it's your best friend Meyer. You and Willie were in his department, weren't you?" "What?" I shouted. That bastard with Teacher Mole on your conscience? That's right. He's got himself a cushy job all winter at the regimental base. Willie scratched his nose. Look, I was just stunned when I saw him, but I walked right past him and pretended I never knew the son of a bitch. He recognized me straight away. Hey you, your last name is Skulls, right? That's right, Mr. Non-Commissioned Officer, I replied. Then he waited to see if I would say anything else. But I didn't. And he began to walk back and forth as he did on the formation. Didn't he teach me how to salute? Why didn't I salute then? Or do all that other old nonsense? I should have been put back in training. Then Vogt, this 2-meter tall giant, came past and he went at Meyer, told him to his face not to mess around, and called me along. Lousy bastard. 2 days later the company was back in action, and the matter was settled. The lorries took us under cover of a small ravine, straight to where the enemy was. We climbed up the slope and began to deploy in a chain for the attack. Then, with rifles at the ready, we moved slowly forward. We were met with furious small arms fire. In an instant we were lying low, crawling into the smallest hollows in the ground for cover. The command to move forward in throws swept through the chain. In words, it was quite simple. All you had to do was jump up, run a couple of paces, then lie down again. But it took a lot of courage to become a target by leaving your hiding place and relying on fate. No one wanted to be the first to jump up and attract the attention of a vigilant enemy. At the same time, no one wanted to lag behind to avoid being labelled a coward. You pressed yourself to the ground, fired a couple of shots at random and glanced back at your comrades to see if they were far ahead, and if it was your turn. The return fire was getting denser and denser. The Russians introduced light mortars into the battle and began to cause us a lot of trouble. Our throws became shorter and the gaps between them longer. Casualties were mounting. Many were bent in half and fell, never to rise again, and the cries of the wounded were heard on all sides. The tempo of the attack slackened. At this moment we received unexpected support. With a roar came 3 Stuka dive bombers, which at low altitude 2 or 3 times laid down a turn, each time at an increasingly acute angle. Then they suddenly spiked, opening a hurricane fire with all available means, and whizzed right over our heads. Hundreds of tiny deadly flashes spewed from the barrels of their machine guns. The roar of the engines, the frantic crackle of the machine guns, and the terrible bursts of fire from the cannons of the aeroplanes merged into one hellish destructive hurricane. We involuntarily jammed our faces into the ground. Our nerves were strained to the limit. Had they mistaken us for Russians? But then we saw tracer shells hitting exactly where we calculated the enemy should have been. Our aeroplanes soared high, hovered for a few moments like soaring birds, then swooped down on the Russians again. Then they rose up and flew back to their bases. The firing behind us ceased. The Russians had apparently retreated, going deeper into the nearby woods. Again we were given the order to move forward. But this time it did not strike such terror into our hearts. Suddenly a violent explosion was heard on our left, a few moments later another. A shrill shout was urgently broadcast along the chain to warn us. Mines. Look out for mines. Orderlies here. There was another explosion and a squeezed scream, a man's cry for help, cross shouts of sharp commands and prolonged groans. Men with stretchers. There was a shout here and there. Stretchers over here. There's a bloke bleeding, he's going to die. Where the hell are those medics? But another mine. Very close. And Kovacs screaming. It's Vogt. Vogt's been hit. We timidly approached Vogt. God almighty. Both his legs have been blown off. There he lay panting in a pool of blood. His eyes, unnaturally large, fixed on Franzel, his blood-stained hand was raised in supplication. Olma, give me your gun. Please. It's all over with me. Please. Or do it yourself. The paramedic came over, but gave only a fleeting glance at the mutilated body, shook his head and dragged on. He was shouted at from all sides. Olma Vogt pleaded, but his voice was growing weaker. Please shoot me. You, friend. Franzel cast a helpless look at me. Should he? Vogt was finished. He was hopeless. Wasn't it our duty to put him out of his misery? We both thought so, Franzel and I, but neither of us had the courage. My thoughts were jumbled in my head. Like a mesmerized man, I stared at the mangled thighs and ripped stomach, which had become one mass of torn flesh, one great wound. Franzel, do it, I whispered. Or should I do it? A last dying breath followed, and the white face slowly sank to the ground. Vogt's suffering was over. At the edge of the forest, near the overturned Russian motorbike, lay a dead woman in uniform. Apparently she had run over one of her own mines. I felt something akin to satisfaction. All that was left of the infernal machine was a shard of metal sticking out of the ground. It was an utterly hopeless endeavor to try to locate the mines. Every step carried death. There was a devil's game with death going on. With a sigh of deep relief, we went deeper into the coolness of the forest. There was little chance that there were mines here. Lieutenant Straub came up from the flank, drenched in sweat. Do you have any wounded? No, none of us are wounded, except Sergeant Vogt. I know about him. I'm terribly sorry too. Another day or two and he'd be on his way home for special training. Keep in contact with your left flank. Watch out for snipers in the trees. 3rd platoon has already run into them. We slowly made our way through the thick undergrowth. Branches clattered against our helmets, whipped our faces and arms. Our boots clung to the thorny thorns. Golden rays of the sun broke through the foliage, caressing the lush green of the fern and moss. It was a romantic picture, but not for us. Quite unexpectedly, we came face to face with 3 Russians with their hands in the air. Their uniforms were perfect camouflage. They could easily take us out. What should we do with them? Kovac suggested that they carry the ammunition, and they shouldered the crates with the greatest of willingness. We put them in the middle of our group. Then, after taking roll call so as not to lose contact with each other, we cautiously continued on our way. We heard a couple of rifle shots to our left, then a few shots to our right, and suddenly machine gun fire. Out of caution, we stopped. One of the prisoners excitedly ran up to Katewake. There, he shouted. There. These Russians had better eyesight than we did. I looked in the direction of his outstretched hand, but saw nothing. Kovac fired. Firing with a thigh rest, Franzel gave the machine gun a more frequent line of fire. Then we heard squeaky voices, and slowly 4 Russians waddled over and surrendered. One was wounded in the arm. They pointed to another, who was dead. A bullet had pierced through his helmet. Straub reappeared and said that we would soon come to a cleared section of woods where we would wait. He took the prisoners with him, and Kovac went with him. It was getting dark. 2 Russian bombers circled overhead. We thought that we need not fear them, that they would never dare to drop bombs as they might hit our own. But they did. But the explosions went off far behind us. The sound was as if 100 trees had been smashed to splinters. There was a terrible rumble. But to us it was no more dangerous than a distant storm. We spent the night on the edge of the clearing, an unpleasant night. Every second man had to stand watch, but even those who got a chance to sleep could hardly sleep a wink. We jumped up at every rustle, but there were no accidents. The next day we came to a huge field ammunition depot. Thousands of shells of all calibers were stacked under the trees. We were cautious because the enemy had not destroyed such a large number of them when he retreated. We feared his use of clockwork or remote fuses, and we hurried on. Judging by the wide, beaten paths leading out of this place, the forest was running out. We were right. Meeting no resistance, we soon reached the last row of trees. We combed the entire virgin forest. The soldier closest to us passed on. Commander's orders: wait at the edge of the forest and stay in cover. Pass it on. A few hundred meters in front of us was an ordinary village, seemingly occupied by the Russians. Far to the right they were still fighting over a small town. Thick puffs of black smoke rose above it. The bursting of artillery shells was clearly visible. We could hear the rumble of the cannons. "The soldiers are over there," exclaimed the astonished Franzel. "A hell of a long way ahead of us." "What do you mean ahead of us?" asked Kovac, who had joined us. "There is no clear front or rear in this idiotic battle. You'll soon see what I mean." Franzel stared tensely in the direction of the disputed territory. "There's something approaching here. It looks like it's an armored vehicle. I bet it's a reconnaissance vehicle." I took the binoculars he handed me. "I think it's a German vehicle. It's been making its way towards us over rough terrain." "Just what we need," Kovac said. "It will help us clear the village." Kovac was right. The order was given to advance on the village, and the light tank poured its rapid-fire cannon into the space between the houses and lunged forward steadily, with half the platoon following. We attacked the village from both flanks. The Russians surrendered. We examined the armored car with great interest. It had undoubtedly saved many lives. The driver pointed out a treacherous little through hole in the turret. "The shot went right through," he said. "A Russian anti-tank gun." That evening the company was given the command to disperse. An officer's car rolled up, and our regimental commander, a lieutenant colonel with insignia, strode forward. "Smear nay," commanded Welty. "Eyes right," he reported in full uniform. The commander thanked him warmly and allowed the soldiers to stand at ease. Then he told us that we were good men and had done well in the battle. He kept talking loudly and verbosely, got confused, and again, coughing, continued his chatter. We heard many words about our sacred fatherland, and that our sacrifices were not in vain. "Shut up," muttered the sheikh. "You'd better be fed properly." At that moment a bullet from a rifle shot whizzed by, and a soldier in the front rank bent in half. All the others jumped for cover. The lieutenant colonel was instantly behind the armoured car. His cap with silver weave came off. He began to carefully pull it up to his side. "Look at him," I said to Franzel. "And these lowlifes are in charge of us today." "Oh, leave that rascal alone." Franzel felt sorry for him. His best days were over. A second bullet whistled in our direction, from over there, shouted several men, pointing to a house across the road. Well, the rapid-fire gun of the armoured car opened fire, and the tracer shells pierced through the wall of the house and passed through the window. The tank took a couple of soldiers on the armour and moved towards the suspicious house. The sergeant was cursing to himself. Whoever scoured this damn place would do a hell of a job. The orderlies carried the wounded man into the commander's car. Look how worried the old man is. You'd think he had a guilty conscience. The armoured car rumbled back. It had done the job of clearing the area. The commander continued his speech. "Comrades, you have suffered heavy losses, but we are making progress, and soon the Russians will be wiped off the face of the earth forever. You are proud at home. Remember this and continue to do your duty as you have done so far. I, for my part, will do everything in my power to secure furloughs soon for some of you." "Do you believe that?" Kovac said grumpily. "I don't." The monotonous clatter of the diesel engine of our truck was so familiar that we almost stopped hearing it, just as one gets used to the ticking of a clock. Often we had to spend the whole day on the road. It felt like we were traveling in circles. We stopped thinking about it. Completely indifferent to everything, we shook on the benches and wished only to go on and on like this, enjoying the inactivity and the feeling of safety. There was plenty of room on the board seats. It was only crowded when the new recruits arrived, but it had been a while since the last battle, and our ranks had thinned again. Our faces were sharpened and stubbled. There were many skirmishes our nerves were on edge. As soon as a heavy fight was imminent, and we foresaw it beforehand, the situation became so tense that the slightest remark was enough to cause a scuffle. It was only the anticipation of a rare lull for a couple of days that brought relief, something like the feeling of the coming end of the working week. When that happened, even a corny joke would elicit an explosion of laughter. Then somehow we realized at once that we were connected to each other, even proud of our collectivism. But such moments were more like the light of an extinguished candle that flares up before going out completely. The thing is, we were afraid. There wasn't a single person among us who wasn't afraid. And even when we eventually got used to it, and hardly realized it anymore, this fear was our constant nightmare. No one wanted to admit what was going on inside them. No one wanted to look like a coward. When you feel bad, you just swear, but it never occurred to anyone that if you swear, you are afraid. Before a battle, when shrapnel is flying everywhere, nobody wants to be the first to raise their head. You try to wait for someone else to do it, and even then you don't rush, you wait for something that might keep you from being suspected of being afraid. If you see a maimed comrade, you call attention to it as an accident, as if you think of it as an accident. You pretend you don't care, but it's just a desperate attempt to deceive yourself. But the nightmare could not be shaken off, and it worsened with every death, with every groan of the dying, and with every slight wound that could dispel the illusion of your invulnerability. Our fears were especially heightened before the battle. It was worse than the battle itself. We felt just as bad afterwards, when the tension was replaced by a complete loss of strength. The only counterbalance was hope, of fragile, groundless, rumor-fueled hope that eventually we would get the order to march back to go home. The lorries converged over the hill. Lieutenant Welty ordered the company to form up. We move out at sunset. The camp kitchen will provide you with hot meals and 2 days' rations, weapons cleaned. Platoon commanders, check the emergency stockpile. You will be issued an extra supply of hand grenades and ammunition before we move. And remember, under no circumstances should you drink well water. Most of the wells in these parts are poisoned. That's all? Razé. We marched in the dusk for about an hour, then the command to entrench was given. We stretched out along a wide front with our sapper spades and began to dig single trenches for cover from the tanks. As always, I worked together with Franzel. A sapper spade is a handy little tool. You hardly feel its weight when it hangs on your waist belt, but it is often more important than a helmet. We had to use it almost daily to dig into the ground to protect ourselves from bullets and shrapnel. Wherever we went, it was the same everywhere. We were entrenching ourselves. Some of us even managed to carry a long-handled shovel with us everywhere. Tiring, of course. Despite all our motorization, we had to walk a hell of a lot. But many times our lives depended on how fast we could get into the ground. Moreover, we also had to dig in the supine position without risking to stick out even the tip of our nose. Little by little we learnt to do that too. We no longer had blisters as we had at first. Now we knew very well how to use our tools without getting tired to dig the best possible trench. Let's pick up the pace. I can't wait to get this over with. Last night I hardly slept a wink. Our little trench was knee-deep when Welty came up. What are you guys up to? You're too far back. Your platoon should be way ahead. Get out. Dig 100 meters ahead. Franzel swore. I have item Franzel spore. Fucking moron. Could he have said that from the beginning? And now we have to do it all over again. The second trench was almost ready when the rascal came again to tell us that we'd have to go further forward to level the front. We almost exploded with indignation. Groaning, we took up a new position and began to dig a third trench. This one wasn't particularly deep. We were exhausted and didn't want any more surprises from Welty. Everywhere around us lights were flashing high in the sky. The Russians were firing red flares. Now over a very wide area there was such a confusion of lights that it was almost impossible to distinguish where any front line lay. In the distance a white flash appeared in the sky, followed by another and another. Our comrades everywhere were watching carefully. In the daytime the flashes looked frivolous, but at night their bright light to everyone, whether his own or the enemy's, was an expression of his intense expectation and readiness. On the right flank we kept in contact with the 2nd Battalion. We surmised that the whole regiment must be brought into the fight. This meant that a large force of Russians must have been operating against us. How large this force was, we only began to realize when it began to get light and a huge shrapnel shell exploded above us, filling the air with an infernal rumble. The steel slammed straight into the ground. Shrapnel whistled a few centimeters above our heads. Others fell back to the ground at random from a great height and rattled our helmets and ammunition boxes and machine guns, while the ground flew upwards in clods. We clamped our ears with our fists and opened our mouths wide. Then we listened tensely for the next near impact. The massive barrage of artillery and heavy mortars continued for almost an hour. Then the infernal rumbling suddenly subsided. Half deafened, we raised our heads and stretched out our stiff limbs. Are we still alive? Suddenly there was a scream. Franzel looked at me. I heard something about tanks, he said. We jumped up and looked in the direction of the Russian positions. There they were, the tanks, coming at us along a wide front, a whole phalanx of T-34 monsters. We were paralyzed with terror. My God, roared Franzel. There must be 40 of them. Now we can make a will. To the right, to the left, everywhere purple flashes filled the sky. Exploding, they fall in garlands of lights. Purple means tanks, purple is a sign of alarm. Then green lights, green means artillery support. Purple, green, and so on without end. A desperate cry for help. The tanks came closer. Behind them came the Russian infantry, in close ranks, the whole terrain filled with brownish figures. Mechanically, I pulled a machine gun out of a shallow trench and placed it in front of me. I began to realize that what was coming at us now was going to be much worse than the previous curtain of fire. If only we had trenched deeper. They'd beat us out of here like flies. It's too late to dig now, Franzel said calmly. And as if he wanted to convince me of that, he took out his ammunition boxes and put a ribbon in the machine gun. We must get out of here, I kept thinking, while there was still time. But I didn't see a single soldier leave his shallow trench, not one ran back. I too dismissed these fear-generated intrusive thoughts, prepared my machine gun, and set up my sights. The shrapnel continued to howl over our heads, but now it was firing in a different direction. Our machine guns set up a fire screen. A pair of anti-tank guns rolled up at high speed and quickly, volley after volley, fired at the huge machines. Our machine guns started to fire. I, too, rained tracer bullets on this mass of metal that was rolling up on us. Then the Russians, who of course had not expected such stubborn resistance, responded with powerful blows. The guns of 40 tanks rumbled, they were supported by mortars, and the firing of many machine guns merged into one deadly chorus. We crawled deeper into our trenches. It was useless to deceive ourselves now we were losing this battle. Our chances of getting out of it alive were very slim. We could compete with their infantry, but they had a huge numerical advantage, and we were powerless against those terrible T-34s. What use were our small guns against such giants? And the only heavier weapon at our disposal that could help us was the long-barrel cannon. These steel monsters, absolutely certain of their invulnerability, would wipe us off the face of the earth. The closer the avalanche came, the more nervous the tension became. Finally, I decided that this nightmarish crawling in the trench was completely unbearable. I stood up to my full height, grabbed my machine gun and opened fire. Nearby lay one of our anti-tank guns, crumpled in a cloud of smoke and dust. A piece of shrapnel bounced off my helmet. The deafening impact stunned me, and I fired my machine gun. I saw a torn hole in one of the ammunition boxes. Franzel dragged me back down into our trench. Only a miracle could save us from total defeat, and that miracle happened. The sky was suddenly filled with a roar that quickly grew into a roar that, because it was uninterrupted, was even more impressive than the chaotic whistling and rumbling of the shells of the firing artillery. Almost losing hope, we looked out and saw Stuka dive bombers wave after wave, wedge-shaped formation rushing downwards. Before we fully realized the reality of what was happening, they had passed over our heads. Then they tilted their right wings sharply, and with the nerve-shattering shrill howl of their sirens they rushed down on the tanks. Black as tar, mushroom-shaped puffs of smoke, swirling, rose into the sky. One of the monster tanks was destroyed after a direct hit. Another flipped over on its back like a giant cockroach, its tracks clanking in the air. Others spun like mad on their axles. The ground shook under the impact of the bombs. More and more squadrons of Stuka bombers were arriving, and they too, one after another, swerved as they flew over us and roared towards the ground. They would stop their dive just in time to avoid hitting the ground. Then candles soar into the air, freeze for a few moments, choosing their next victim, then go down again, their forward extended landing gear like the talons of birds of prey in search of prey. Heaven and earth became one hellish sea of fire and destruction. Now these hulking tanks, for all their intimidating appearance, were scattering left and right, trying to flee. The wall of metal was disintegrating in panic. Clouds of Messerschmitt and Heinkel fighters were now attacking the infantry with shrapnel bombs from strafing. They passed only a few meters above the heads of the Russians, who scattered in all directions, terrified. We got out of our individual trenches and stood and watched this grand spectacle. After the nervous tension of the last few hours, which had driven us to our very bones, we suddenly felt amazement and a certain euphoria. Soldiers, hardened in many battles, hugged each other and laughed until they cried. Others danced and patted themselves on the sides in sheer delight. Willie shouted with an excess of emotion. Shaken Kovac began to box. Franzel suddenly kicked me hard in the ribs. "Give him hell," shouted one of the soldiers into the sky. Come on! Come on! Drop those balls!" exclaimed another. "Give them a light. Look! There's a couple of those damn bugs trying to get away. That's it, break their horns." It wasn't a war anymore. It was a breathtaking display of defeat, controlled and managed. What followed was a frontal assault and relentless pursuit. It was like an organized jungle hunt, even with corrals. Only in a few places did isolated groups of enemy soldiers attempt to put up some resistance. The Russians were surrendering in droves. Many were trembling, stammering, almost sobbing the whole time. We could not understand a word, but the horror in their eyes told us of the hell they had endured. The whole surrounding area was strewn with the wreckage of tanks, twisted, blackened pieces of metal. The Russian artillery was silent. Their batteries had taken a beating, too. Our victory was complete, as only victory can be. We took hundreds of prisoners and captured a huge amount of combat equipment. When this eventful day passed, our hearts were filled with new hope and confidence. I don't think there was a single one of us at that moment who was not convinced that we were winning the war. We were in a state of some kind of intoxication. We had completely forgotten about the previous hours spent under the terrible rampart of fire and the moments of despair as we faced what seemed like an unstoppable invasion of armor and steel. Yes, we have forgotten about all that for now. But the existence of the threat to life at the front remained the same. The next day, as the lorries took us to the next battlefield, we felt the same terror. It all came back to us again when some jerk remarked that now we finally had enough space to get comfortable. Then we suddenly realized for the first time that our company had never been so small before. We halted by a small, narrow lake. I think a good sportsman could get a hand grenade from one shore to the other. The water was dark green and murky, though not so muddy as in an ordinary village pond. A wide belt of reeds covered the bank, and the branches of a couple of spreading trees made a pleasant shade, while their leaves rustled in the wind. It was an idyllic picture in an ideal place for recuperation. The atmosphere was serene. For once we could relax and release the tension of the last few weeks. No crushing shrapnel, no deadly bullets flying past, no stench of rotting bodies, and nothing to remind you of the bloody spectacle. It seemed like something out of the ordinary, this life with only the occasional distant thunder of cannon on the wind, like a distant warning of what was to come. The new reserves came up to fill our thinning ranks. Among the new arrivals were quite a number of youths, some of whom were 2 or 3 years younger than our youngest soldiers. Most of them arrived just after they had been through a short course of training. They addressed us respectfully, as if we were officers. At first we couldn't believe our ears, then we just enjoyed it, and some of the guys put on a bossy look and chastised the young troublemakers mercilessly. But when one of the old men began to harass such a newcomer and practically made him his servant, Kovacs reprimanded him in no uncertain terms. Then the sheikh held the newcomer back. "Hey, listen," he shouted. "Wait a minute. I want to talk to you." The poor man obediently approached the sheikh. "Be a bit more energetic, if you don't mind, mate. You're quite young after all. What's your name?" "Infantryman Nagali, sir," and the young fighter stared at the sheikh's left sleeve, trying to recognize his rank. But of course there wasn't any baldric there, and that made the small man very confused, but just to be on the safe side he paused. The sheikh pretended not to notice and patronizingly patted the lad on the shoulder. "So, you're a Nigel foot soldier, then? You're going to be a brave soldier, I hope?" There was a rather uncertain answer. Certainly, he stammered. At least he was no longer trying to find out the sheikh's non-existent rank, and now the sheikh pretended to be really pissed off. "You don't seem to have been trained at home for long," he growled. "You know as little about soldiering as a cow knows about laying eggs. For the last time I ask you, will you endeavour to serve?" The boy blushed scarlet. "Now listen, son," said the sheikh authoritatively. "I'm telling you this for your own good. If you ever try to address us as officers here again, you'll know me then. I'll tear you to pieces, you stupid little punk." More relieved than confused, Nagali joined in the general laughter. We all shook his hand and called our names. For us, the days on the training ground were far behind us. Almost a year had passed since then, and when we recalled that period of our lives, we did so with an indulgent smile. We thought that the week of rest we had been given was just that, a period of peace. It turned out to be a complete illusion. For exactly 2 days we were allowed to relax. On the 3rd day, Lieutenant Welty ordered us out of formation and told us what he had in store for us: 3 hours of daily drill, cleaning and repairing equipment, inspections. Same as always. "I will personally check everything," he said. "In addition, I want to emphasize that I will not tolerate the slightest slackness or violations of the established order. Platoon commanders and NTOs must ensure that the strictest discipline is maintained, especially proper saluting. And I don't want to see any squad leaders getting familiar with their men. If I do, I'll mete out the most severe punishment. Break it up." We were all extremely angry, but we could only spew curses and complain to the heavens. Franzel was the most furious. "The lads are already crawling about in the mud, where they can be swatted at any moment, night or day, so that everyone is a ball of nerves. And here comes this stinker and spoils our lives. Mark my words. That bloody bastard will get the Knight's Cross. In fact, he's going to get it just for driving us round the bend." When we had all let off a little steam, The sheik stretched out in front of Kovac and clicked his heels. "I dare report. Herr Fieldfebel," he shouted at the top of his voice. "I beg your permission to go for a piss." Kovac, who had once been our squad leader, spat right under Sheik's feet. Now we had to march under the scorching sun in formation in full uniform, moreover, with gas masks on. Lieutenant Welty did not want to put anyone in command. He liked to give the commands himself. "Get down, stand up, round, on your stomach, crawl forward." We practiced the weapons attack over and over again, using machine guns, and we were shown the technique of falling to the ground as if we didn't know it. But that wasn't all. Welty also made us practice the goose step, the style of marching on parade. God almighty. Just a couple of kilometers away, soldiers were dying in the trenches, and here we were being trained to march in the style of parade cleaners. Kovac took our squad to a secluded spot, where we weren't so visible to that bastard of a lieutenant. "Please," said Kovac, "let's do a couple of these tricks to please him." Like puppets, we threw our hands up for honor and put them down, and when the lieutenant appeared, Kovac shouted at the top of his voice, "Scholz, keep your elbows sharp. That's better. Brodenfeld and Nageli, keep your heads up. Jungling, get your greasy fingers out." Greasy fingers, what nonsense, muttered the sheik. But the last words of his tirade were, thank God, inaudible. Then Welty began to command himself and told us how to do it properly. None of us tried to please him, except 3 of his sergeants, real scoundrels and overseers from the past. 2 of them had arrived with the latest batch of reinforcements. Only a few weeks ago they had been brave green recruits, not old soldiers who had smelled the gunpowder, and one of them was this bull-necked Meyer, who commanded the very squad in which the dead Vogt had served. You could tell by the shrill tone of his voice that he was in his element again. Until now we had kept away from him to avoid a scandal. Now he was really angry with us, especially because we had made no secret of what we thought of him. At the same time he feared everyone but Willie, so he chose him, knowing that by annoying him he was annoying us. The next day Meyer had an opportunity. Willie was just passing him, absorbed in his own thoughts. "Scholz, why don't you salute me? You don't want to do it, do you?" Immediately he made Willie salute him 5 times in a row. Willie was so confused that he forgot what he was going to do before that. That evening, when the rations were announced, it was Willie's turn. One of the soldiers called out to him, "Be a friend, Scholz, take ours too. We don't have time now." Willie came back fully loaded and handed our rations to the rest of the company. A minute later we heard Meyer's husky voice. "Where are the cigarettes?" Willie had forgotten about the cigarettes. I don't know what he replied, we only heard Meyer's voice. "What? Didn't you get anything?" "I don't want to hear that impudent lie. You bring the cigarettes, and in double quantity." Willie went to the supply lorry again, and I followed him. The supply sergeant was a nutcracker-faced bloke and wouldn't listen to him. "I've already given you your ration. Be more careful next time. Get out of here." But he never got cigarettes. I objected. "Get out." The supply clerk said angrily, "None of your damn business." The way back was like a scaffold for Willie. Meyer came at him, his face red with anger. "What's all this nonsense about the supply sergeant not giving you what you're entitled to? You mean he's holding back the cigarettes? Why don't you answer me, you little brat? I bet I know who took them." And after a considerable pause, he added snidely, "Those rascals you've been hobnobbing with, Ulmer and the others, they'll find out about it." I looked at Franzel and found the sheik with my eyes. Franzel didn't say a word, just gritted his teeth, but the sheik couldn't stand it. "It is clear now," he said indignantly. "Now we'll show the scoundrel what he's been up to." When Meyer saw us coming, He stopped harassing Willie at once. The boy was as pale as death. "What do you want?" Maya asked. "Get out of here." Without saying a word, we turned round to face him. Then I calmly said, "Sergeant Maya, I overheard you suspecting us of something." And Franzel added with menace in his voice, "You mentioned my name as someone who knows where those cigarettes went. And I'm one of the scoundrels Willie's in cahoots with put in the Sheik." There was a rather uncertain answer. Certainly, he stammered. At least he was no longer trying to find out the Sheik's non-existent rank, and now the Sheik pretended to be really pissed off. "You don't seem to have been trained at home for long," he growled. "You know as little about soldiering as a cow knows about laying eggs. For the last time, I ask you, will you endeavour to serve?" The boy blushed scarlet. "Now listen, son," said the Sheik authoritatively. "I'm telling you this for your own good. If you ever try to address us as officers here again, you'll know me then. I'll tear you to pieces, you stupid little punk." More relieved than confused, Nageli joined in the general laughter. We all shook his hand and called our names. For us, the days on the training ground were far behind us. Almost a year had passed since then, and when we recalled that period of our lives, we did so with an indulgent smile. We thought that the week of rest we had been given was just that, a period of peace. It turned out to be a complete illusion. For exactly 2 days we were allowed to relax. On the third day, Lieutenant Welty ordered us out of formation and told us what he had in store for us: 3 hours of daily drill, cleaning and repairing equipment, inspections. Same as always. "I will personally check everything," he said. "In addition, I want to emphasize that I will not tolerate the slightest slackness or violations of the established order. Platoon commanders and NTOs must ensure that the strictest discipline is maintained, especially proper saluting. And I don't want to see any squad leaders getting familiar with their men. If I do, I'll mete out the most severe punishment. Break it up." We were all extremely angry, but we could only spew curses and complain to the heavens. Franzel was the most furious. "The lads are already crawling about in the mud, where they can be swatted at any moment, night or day, so that everyone is a ball of nerves. And here comes this stinker and spoils our lives. Mark my words. That bloody bastard will get the Knight's Cross. In fact, he's going to get it just for driving us round the bend." When we had all let off a little steam, the Sheik stretched out in front of Kovac and clicked his heels. "I dare report. Herr Fieldverbell," he shouted at the top of his voice, "I beg your permission to go for a piss." Kovac, who had once been our squad leader, spat right under Sheik's feet. Now we had to march under the scorching sun in formation in full uniform, moreover, with gas masks on. Lieutenant Welty did not want to put anyone in command. He liked to give the commands himself. "Get down, stand up, round, on your stomach, crawl forward." We practiced the weapons attack over and over again, using machine guns, and we were shown the technique of falling to the ground as if we didn't know it. But that wasn't all. Welty also made us practice the goose step, the style of marching on parade. God Almighty! Just a couple of kilometers away, soldiers were dying in the trenches, and here we were being trained to march in the style of parade cleaners. Kovac took our squad to a secluded spot, where we weren't so visible to that bastard of a lieutenant. "Please," said Kovac, "let's do a couple of these tricks to please him." Like puppets, we threw our hands up for honor and put them down, and when the lieutenant appeared, Kovac shouted at the top of his voice, "Schultz, keep your elbows sharp. That's better. Brodenfeld and Nageli, keep your heads up. Jungling, get your greasy fingers out." Greasy fingers, what nonsense, muttered the Sheik. But the last words of his tirade were, thank God, inaudible. Then Welty began to command himself and told us how to do it properly. None of us tried to please him. except 3 of his sergeants, real scoundrels and overseers from the past. 2 of them had arrived with the latest batch of reinforcements. Only a few weeks ago they had been brave green recruits, not old soldiers who had smelled the gunpowder, and one of them was this bull-necked Maya, who commanded the very squad in which the dead Vogt had served. You could tell by the shrill tone of his voice that he was in his element again. Until now we had kept away from him to avoid a scandal. Now he was really angry with us, especially because we had made no secret of what we thought of him. At the same time, he feared everyone but Willie, so he chose him, knowing that by annoying him he was annoying us. The next day Maya had an opportunity. Willie was just passing him, absorbed in his own thoughts. "Strolls, why don't you salute me? You don't want to do it, do you?" Immediately he made Willie salute him 5 times in a row. Willie was so confused that he forgot what he was going to do before that. That evening, when the rations were announced, it was Willie's turn. One of the soldiers called out to him. "Be a friend, Scholes, take ours too. We don't have time now." Willie came back fully loaded and handed our rations to the rest of the company. A minute later we heard Maya's husky voice. "Where are the cigarettes?" "Sarah Latorbaniten." Willie had forgotten about the cigarettes. I don't know what he replied, we only heard Maya's voice. "What? Didn't you get anything?" "I don't want to hear that impudent lie. You bring the cigarettes, and in double quantity." Willie went to the supply lorry again, and I followed him. The supply sergeant was a nutcracker-faced bloke and wouldn't listen to him. "I've already given you your ration. Be more careful next time. Get out of here." But he never got cigarettes. I objected. "Get out." The supply clerk said angrily, "None of your damn business." The way back was like a scaffold for Willie. Maya came at him, his face red with anger. "What's all this nonsense about the supply sergeant not giving you what you're entitled to? You mean he's holding back the cigarettes? Why don't you answer me, you little brat? I bet I know who took them." And after a considerable pause, he added snidely, "Those rascals you've been hobnobbing with, Ulmer and the others, they'll find out about it." I looked at Franzel and found the sheik with my eyes. Franzel didn't say a word, just gritted his teeth, but the sheik couldn't stand it. "It is clear now," he said indignantly. "Now we'll show the scoundrel what he's been up to." When Maya saw us coming, he stopped harassing Willie at once. The boy was as pale as death. "What do you want?" Maya asked. "Get out of here." Without saying a word, we turned round to face him. Then I calmly said, "Sergeant Maya, I overheard you suspecting us of something." And Franzel added with menace in his voice, "You mentioned my name as someone who knows where those cigarettes went. And I'm one of the scoundrels Willie's in cahoots with," put in the sheik. Maya pretended to be indignant. "How dare you talk to me like that? What's going on here? A conspiracy? I'll report it, you can be sure of it. Now get the hell out of here." Franzel's cheek twitched and he whispered, "What about those cigarettes?" "Are you deaf?" Maya shouted. "I told you to get the hell out of here. I'll find out what happened to those cigarettes." "The supply sergeant took them," I said. "Scholes already told you that." But Franzel couldn't contain himself any longer. He was boiling with indignation. "We'll find out for sure." He shouted, "It's damned mean to cast suspicion on us. You can muddy us in the service, Maya, but we're not going to stand for this." Maya pressed his clenched fists against his thighs and extended his massive chin. "Did you say mix it with mud? Did you actually say mix it with mud?" Whoever. He was starting to shake with anger. "You know damn well who mixes soldiers with mud, Maya," Franzel said. "Or have you forgotten about this little man called Mole? Back in the camp, you hounded him, didn't you? Mole is on your conscience, Maya." But you know you can't do the same to skulls. Maya was out of his mind. He couldn't find words. Instead, he grabbed Franzel's hands. Are you threatening me? He finally squeezed out. You stupid puppy. You insolent. You! Get your hands off me, Franzel said calmly. You stupid little brat. I'll show you. For the last time, Maya, get your hands off me. But Maya paid no attention. He pulled Franzel to him and started shaking him like a hazel tree. Do you think you can tell me what I should and should not do? He roared. Throwing out his fist sharply, Franzel threw a straight right punch. It slammed into Maya's ugly face like a battering ram. Gulping for air, Maya staggered backwards, raising his arms in defense. But Franzel didn't stop, unleashing a hurricane of blows at him. Maya was stunned and staggered like a drunken man, staggering clumsily backwards until he finally fell to his knees. Oh no! Franzel exclaimed. Get up, Maya! We're not finished with you yet. With one grip, he lifted Maya to his feet and shook him mercilessly, as if he were angry that the bully had avoided a fight. Then he punched him right in the temple. The two guys from Maya's squad watched, patting themselves on the sides in excitement. There wasn't a man in the whole crowd who wasn't happy to see Maya get what he deserved. At last Maya staggered away and sank to the floor. He was all beaten up. His fleshy face looked fatter than ever. Feldbel Ulmer will allow himself to inform Sergeant Maya that he can go now, Franzel said in a voice full of contempt, thoughtfully wiping his knuckles on his trousers. Maya got up, put a handkerchief to his bleeding nose and, muttering threats, walked away. At this critical moment, Lieutenant Straub appeared on the scene. What the hell is going on here? He asked me. I told him everything that had happened, and he roared. Jesus Christ, kids, what a mess you've got here. We can only hope for the best. But Ulmer, you son of a bitch, frankly, I wouldn't want to be in your shoes. Later we were called by the commander, who looked at us unpleasantly. Straub was right there. Very good, Maya said the commander. Please tell us again what happened to you. Maya reported in a somewhat muffled voice his nose was badly broken, but he didn't say a word about the cigarettes. Welty turned to Franzel. What can you say, Ulmer? Franzel didn't utter a word. He just stared at Maya as if he was ready to lunge at him again. Welty stood up and said, Boys, what you've done, and you know it, is open mutiny. Feldwebel Ulmer, stay here for now. You will come with me to battalion headquarters. The rest of you wait in your squads for further orders. Now Straub spoke. He was on Franzel's side. It was one of his best soldiers, and he could not sacrifice him. He conceded that the way Ulmer had behaved deserved censure, but he was annoyed with Maya. And Straub went on to recount the cigarette incident exactly as we have recounted it. Is it true? Welty asked sternly, clearly displeased that Maya had concealed this fact. Maya stretched out even more. Herr Senior Lieutenant, he said. I only said, I mean cigarettes, I mean skulls. Then he fell silent and busied himself with his handkerchief. By putting him under suspicion, Maya certainly provoked him, Straub said. He added that Maya was not a sympathetic soldier in his own squad he was often complained about. Looking up, Welty dismissed this statement. Maya's unpopularity, he said, does not change the fact that we are guilty of insubordination or worse. Nevertheless, Welty let us go, though of course he poured torrents of profanity on us, including some directed at Straub. And don't think this is the end of it, he finished. A few minutes later we heard a terrible noise near the supply lorries. We strained our ears and Straub's voice came through clearly. Such a shout had never before been heard from him. Soon afterwards a supply sergeant, frowning and anxious, appeared and brought us our due ration of cigarettes.